Okay, I need to rant about something real quick. It feels like most of the times nowadays when I'm watching or I hear about film awards, all of the editing, technical, or directorial awards are predominantly given or received by men. And as a technical person in theater and film, I have started to wonder why all of these awards are so dominated by men. Like, where are all my women in STEM? Uh, Not a serious question, but it did make me think about going back to the early days before the 1930s. In the silent era of film, it was predominantly dominated by women, especially after like Alice Guy Blanche, the first female director. And so prior to the 1930s and the era of sound, women were everywhere in the development of film. They acted in the majority of the pictures. They directed, they wrote scripts. Fun fact, in this era, female screenwriters outnumbered male screenwriters 10 to 1. They designed sets and costumes, they made executive decisions, they edited. Editing was one of the biggest feats of women in early film. In the early film era, it was considered to be a feminine job due to its similarities in sewing. But editing is what makes film film. So they were doing a lot of they were huge part of film production. And that was the theme of early cinema. It was cheap, it was experimental, and it was not considered like a glamorous job. So women were able to make great strides in development because they also weren't taken seriously. And of course, all this changes once we reach the entering the 1930s. It was already a time of considered like oppression for women. The Great Depression begins, and the unemployment strikes skyrockets. And like what jobs there were kept for men, especially white men. And this is coincidentally the era of color and sound in film. So sound begins to enter film in mid to late 1920s, and Technicolor follows after in the 1930s with the three-strip color process. And so by the 1930s, they were better developed, they were cheaper and to implement or to use. So both of these inventions, along with the fact that film started to make a good amount of money, started to bring many more men into the industry. Men that were given jobs and positions of power just because they were men. Editing was suddenly seen as a prestigious or important part of development, so not only were women pushed away from producing and directing, they were also pushed from editing. And now that doesn't mean that color and sound like absolutely destroyed like the representation and roles of women in film. Costume and set design grew with color. It allowed for greater imagination, and there were still a good amount of female writers who were allowed to write like witty and complex dialogue now, and they were allowed to develop more independent female characters. Women who were able to stay in editing became like strong inspirations and examples for the women of the time, which I find to be a complicated topic because sure there were a few women in editing still and became inspirations, but also the only reason they were there is because men let them stay there because they were valuable enough to them and they made the men more money. So I don't know if personally I don't see it very much as inspiring as exploitative. Even acting became hard for women because suddenly their voices had to be appealing or desirable. So those with heavy accents or squeaky voices were dropped. Just another detail that made it harder for women to keep their place in film is the Hays Code, or the Motion Picture Production Code, adopted in 1930. The Hays Code overall restricted what could be portrayed in movies, especially with themes of sex, violence, and crime. To note, the Comics Code followed soon after, and it had similar restrictions. So when looking at the roles of women in films and comics after these codes were implemented, you start to see many similarities. like messages promoting the sanctity of marriage, and how many of the lead roles in these stories were given to men. And if the lead was a woman, then she was predominantly white, and she was always either a mother or a wife. And it is interesting to see how the push against women in films is almost reflected in the comics at the time as well. And of course, these restrictions also on acting and roles of women in film just got tighter when we entered the... Now, studios began to develop in the 1920s, but they really started to ramp up and in the 1930s and then into the 1940s. When the studio era reaches its full swing, it is considered the golden era of studios of film. This is a time where most studios were developing up to 50 films a year with their assembly line production methods. And then with the Hays Codes, these films condoned and punished crimes, and they held women to strict social expectations like being a good domestic partner or being expected to give up your hopes and dreams for the betterment of the family. And as in family, it's usually for her husband or children. And it's a time where women are almost only portrayed as wives or mothers. No matter how independent they may be in the film, there's always a man or child influencing her decisions. And there were still a few female directors, like Dorothy Arzner in the early 40s. She directed Dance Girl Dance, which carries a strong female perspective. And while it is still affected by the male gaze and the Hays Code, the female lead feels particularly three-dimensional, especially when she tells the crowd at the burlesque theater off, and when she gets into a fight with Bubbles, and then throughout the film, her one dream is always dancing. And it almost becomes disappointing to see at the end when she's unable to obtain her dream without a man. So she needs a man to give her her chance to dance, and he only does that because he sees monetary value in her. But when you compare Dance Girl Dance to other studio films like Meet Me in St. Louis, you can tell that one was directed by a woman and one was directed by a man, just by comparing how the two female leads are portrayed. One being more three-dimensional, one being flat. During this studio era, men hired men, and so women were pushed almost exclusively to acting or costume design. Actresses and actors were held to strict contracts that while it did give them job security, these actors could only work with one studio, and they had to act in whatever that studio wanted them to act in. And they had to stay with that studio until their contracts were terminated, which many studios would add time to the contract, so if an actor had a gap where they weren't working, they would have time added. And these systems had more cons than pros, for actors especially, while studios benefited from the exploitation. Studios were ran and directed by men, as less and less women are represented in film. From the 1920s to the 1940s, female acting roles were cut from 40% to 20%, while directing and producing roles dropped to almost zero. And these studio restrictions did not drop until a woman, Olivia de Havilland, sued Warner Brothers for adding time to her contract. And she won the case, which led to the termination of strict studio contracts. And then the United States government got involved and sued Paramount for the way they distributed movies to theaters. And these two cases brought about the collapse of the studio era, thank goodness. But I find it interesting that when discussing the end of the studio era, most people bring up the U.S. government and the Hays Code, for taking down the studio monopoly, but not a lot of people seem to remember that a woman started the whole process of taking down the studio era. I digress. The studio era ends in the 1940s, and we finally reach the 1950s brings around the beginning of television, which the popularity of only increased exponentially into the 1960s. This is an interesting time for women in the film because the Hays Codes persisted until the end of the 1960s. Restrict, so while film restricts like female representation and characters on screen, behind the screen, new opportunities start to arise. With studios now making fewer but larger films, the television industry starts growing, and women are able to jump back into directing and writing and editing. Um, while it never, while the number of women working on film never again reaches the numbers of the silent era, they are like more openings start coming up, allowing for new themes to be explored. Of course, the 1950s is also post World War II nuclear family era, so while more women are allowed to work on films, the representation is still strictly wife and mother, or falling in love with a man, straight, heterosexual, represent white representation. And looking at film and television today, I wonder how far we've really come from that narrative of mother and child. Sure, women have more opportunities today, but the number of women working on films is still very low. Awards are still primarily given to men, especially in big studio awards. And I feel like the story of being a mother, being a wife, is still being told, just maybe in a different fashion. I think we haven't really lost the messages and themes of the Hays Code, besides maybe in more experimental studios, which again don't get as much viewership as big studios do. It makes me wonder what the film industry would look like today if it was still female dominated like it was in the silent era. But what do I know? People only like women when they are seen, not heard. So, thank you.